The night she found out, her hands didn't shake. That was the part nobody would have believed. She'd done the math wrong. That was how she always thought about it later. Like it was an accounting error, something she could have caught if she'd checked the numbers twice. She'd believed that a man who remembered her coffee order after 2 years, who texted back within 4 minutes, who introduced her to his mother as the one. She'd believed that man was incapable of the kind of arithmetic that put her sister's name in his phone at 11:30 on a Tuesday. Imogen had always been good with numbers. It was the only thing she'd ever been truly, undeniably good at. Not pretty, not charming, not the kind of woman people remembered when she left a room, but give her a column of figures and she'd find the mistake under a minute. She'd built a career on it. She'd believed, stupidly, that she could apply the same precision to people. She couldn't. She found out on the morning of what was supposed to be the most important day of her life, which was so perfectly awful that if someone had written it in a script, she'd have called it 2 on the nose. She was sitting at the breakfast table in the hotel suite Declan had booked for her. Paid for, she later learned, with a card that his father actually owned, going through her own spreadsheet of vendor payments, because that was the kind of woman she was, the kind who reconciles invoices on her wedding morning, when his phone lit up on the counter. She wasn't snooping. She wasn't even curious. She'd seen that phone 1,000 times. She'd charged it for him when his cord died. She'd read him texts when he was driving. She'd memorized his passcode without meaning to the same way she memorized everything. Numbers just stuck. The text was from Romy, not a name she recognized at first. Then she scrolled up, the way you do when something doesn't quite add up and you need to see the full column, and there it was. 13 weeks of messages. Her sister Romy. The same Romy who was supposed to be in the chair next to hers right now, getting her hair done, holding her dress off the floor. Imogen sat with the phone in both hands for a long time. She didn't cry, she ran the numbers. 13 weeks meant it started in February, which meant the weekend. Declan said he was in Denver for a conference. He wasn't in Denver. It meant the Tuesday nights he said he was working late. There were 6 of them in the thread. He wasn't working. It meant the small, strange distance she'd felt in March and chalked up to pre-wedding nerves was not nerves. She'd found the discrepancy. She just couldn't fix it. The florist was due at 11, the photographer at noon, the ceremony at 4. She calculated, approximately 7 hours of people asking if she was okay, if she needed anything, if she'd eaten, before she had to stand in front of 200 guests and perform the happiest day of her life. She set Declan's phone back on the counter, exactly where she'd found it. She went into the bathroom. She ran cold water over her wrists, the way she did when she needed to think clearly, and she stood there for 3 minutes looking at herself in the mirror. The hotel robe, the hair half done, the mascara she'd put on, and then removed because she always cried at emotional things and hadn't wanted to redo it twice. She looked, she thought, like a woman who was running a calculation that kept coming out wrong. She didn't call the florist. She didn't call her mother. She picked up her own phone, called a car, put on the clothes she'd worn to the hotel the night before. Dark jeans, a grey sweater that had seen better days, and she walked out of the suite with her wallet, her phone, and exactly nothing else. She left the dress hanging on the back of the bathroom door. She ended up at a bar she'd never been to, which was the point. She didn't want somewhere familiar. She didn't want anywhere she might run into someone who knew her face or her name, or the fact that she was supposed to be getting married in 4 hours. She wanted somewhere loud enough that she couldn't hear herself think, and dark enough that no one would look at her too closely. The place was called something with anchor in the name, and it smelled like old wood, and the kind of whiskey people ordered, when they didn't care what kind of whiskey it was. The lunchtime crowd was already turning over, businessmen, mostly, the kind who wore suits that fit too well and talked too loud about things that didn't matter. She found a stool at the far end of the bar, as close to the wall as she could get, and ordered a bourbon she couldn't afford and didn't taste. The bartender didn't ask questions. She appreciated that. She sat there for a while, long enough for her phone to light up 12 times. Declan, then her mother, then Declan again, then her maid of honor, whose name was Petra but wasn't in this story, and she watched it light up and she did not answer, and eventually she turned it face down and ordered a second drink. She was doing the math again. She couldn't stop. 13 weeks, 6 late Tuesdays, 1 weekend in February that wasn't Denver. And Romy, who had sat across from her at Christmas and laughed and refilled her wine and looked directly at her with the same eyes their mother gave them both, and said nothing. The number that kept surfacing was 7, as in 7 years with Declan, as in she had given 7 years to a man who decided, apparently, that the version of her that existed in her own sister's body was more worth keeping. She'd done the math on the relationship too, the same way she did everything. The deposits on the venue, the catering contract, the dress that cost more than her first car and was currently hanging on a bathroom door in a hotel room she'd paid for herself because Declan's card had a weird delay with the hostel's system and she'd said it was fine, she'd just put it on hers. It's fine. It wasn't fine. She'd always done that. Covered the gap when the numbers didn't quite add up. She was good at it. It turned out she'd been doing it her entire relationship without noticing. The bar stool beside her moved. She didn't look up. She was not in the condition to make eye contact with a stranger and perform any version of a human being having a normal day. "You're in my seat." The voice was low. Not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of a voice that had never needed to raise itself to be heard. She looked up then. The man standing beside her was not the kind of man you forgot. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, she guessed, though there was something about the way he held himself that made the age feel irrelevant. Like calling a building old when what you meant was that it had been through things. Dark suit. White shirt with no tie, collar open in a way that suggested the tie had been removed deliberately, not carelessly. A jaw that looked like it had been made with function rather than aesthetics in mind, and a scar that ran from just below his left ear to the corner of his mouth that no one in his position had acquired doing anything polite. His eyes were grey. Not interesting grey, not silver or slate. Just grey, like the colour the sky went when something was coming. She thought, this is the kind of man who has a seat at a bar, who has things in the possessive and absolute sense. She thought, I have had an extremely bad morning and I am not moving. She said, technically I was here first. The grey eyes did something that wasn't quite amusement. Technically, he said, the gentleman at the end of the bar has been here longer than either of us, and that doesn't appear to be his seat either. She looked at the man at the end of the bar. He was asleep. Fine, she said. I'll concede the point, but I'm not moving. There was a pause. It was not the pause of a man who was deciding whether to push back. It was the pause of a man who was evaluating something and taking his time about it, the way she evaluated a spreadsheet before she flagged an error. Methodically, without hurry, he sat down. Not at the next stool. At the one right beside her, which was in fact his seat. Fair enough, he said, and signaled the bartender with 2 fingers. She didn't intend to talk to him. She was quite sure he didn't intend to talk to her either. He had the look of a man who had come to this bar for a specific reason that had nothing to do with conversation, and who was politely ignoring the fact that a woman in a grey sweater with undone hair and the particular posture of someone who had recently received very bad news was sitting 18 inches away from him. It was the invoice that started it. She'd pulled out her notebook. She carried a small one, always, for the same reason she always had a pen, and she'd started doing the math again, the way she did when she needed to get it out of her head and onto paper, and she'd written down all of it. The venue deposit, non-refundable. The catering, non-refundable, with a caveat about extenuating circumstances she was planning to dispute. The florist, technically cancelable if she called before noon, which, she checked her watch, was 43 minutes away. You're running numbers, the man beside her said. She glanced up. He was looking at the notebook, not at her. His expression was neutral in a way that suggested neutral was a practiced state. I'm running numbers, she agreed. Anything interesting depends on your definition. She turned back to the page. I'm calculating how much the worst day of my life cost me. A pause. And $11,416, give or take. The florist is ambiguous. He looked at her then, not the way men usually looked at her, which was to say briefly and without much registration. He looked at her the way she looked at a set of books that didn't balance, like he was trying to locate the discrepancy. "On what?" he said. "On whether I call before noon and get a partial refund, or whether I just accept the 11,000 and stop looking at it. What happens at noon?" "I was supposed to get married," she said, and because it was the first time she'd said it out loud, the words came out a little stranger than she'd intended. Not broken, just displaced, like a number in the wrong column. He didn't say "I'm sorry," and she was grateful for that. He said, "But you're here." "But I'm here," she agreed. He signaled for another round without asking if she wanted one. She let it happen. His name, he told her eventually, was Rafferty, just Rafferty. No first name offered, in the way of a man who had learned that names were handles and handles could be used to move you. She filed it in the column labeled information and didn't push. She told him her name was Imogen. He repeated it once, quietly, like he was checking the spelling. She told him very little else. He told her even less. They sat for a while in the particular silence of two people who had no need to perform anything for each other, and she thought, "This is the strangest I have felt today, and today has been extremely strange." At some point, she'd lost track of exactly when, which was unusual for her. Two men in dark suits, materialized on the other side of him, spoke briefly and quietly into his ear, and retreated. He'd acknowledged them with a movement so small it barely registered, the kind of gesture that meant "I heard you" and handle it simultaneously. She noticed everything. It was, at this point, both her greatest professional asset and her most exhausting personal quality. "You have people," she said. "Everyone has people," he said. "Not like that." He looked at her sidelong, not quite a question. "The man at the end of the bar has been awake for the past 10 minutes, she said. "And he's been watching you since your people walked over. He's not drunk, he's watching the exit too." She paused. "I notice things. It's a problem." Something shifted in Rafferty's expression, barely like a decimal point moving one place. "No," he said. "It's not." What happened next was, she acknowledged later, the result of bourbon, catastrophic emotional destabilization, and the specific variety of recklessness that only comes from having already lost something you thought was foundational to your life. She did not intend to be still at the bar when the two men came back. She did not intend to overhear the name they gave him, a name she didn't recognize but would later, or to see the way Rafferty's jaw changed when he heard it. She did not intend to say, "Whatever it is, run it as a loss this quarter and offset it against the Meridian acquisition. If the basis is what I think it is, you've got a step-up that makes the number work." She had no idea why she said it. Possibly the bourbon. Possibly 7 years of stored frustration at being underestimated finally finding an outlet. Rafferty was very still. The two men looked at her the way people looked at a calculator that had unexpectedly spoken. "Excuse me," said the taller of the two. "The Meridian deal," she said, because she had already started and had nothing left to lose. "I'm guessing it's structured as an asset purchase, not a stock deal, or you wouldn't be running the numbers separately. If you've got the right cost basis documentation, and you would if whoever did your books is competent, you can use the step-up in basis to absorb the loss on whatever that other thing is, and come out at worst flat for the quarter." She looked at the notebook in front of her. "I could show you the math." There was a silence. Rafferty said, "She stays." The two men looked at him, then at her, then they left. She looked at Rafferty. "I don't know why I said that," she said. "I do," he said. "You're very good with numbers." "I work in forensic accounting," she said. "Or I did. Until about 3 weeks ago when my firm was acquired, and they eliminated my position, which is its own separate spreadsheet of catastrophe I'm not currently looking at." "What are you looking at?" $11,416, the florist question, and whether Declan ever actually went to Denver, did he? "No." Rafferty was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you want to know what the actual number is?" She looked at him. "What number? The one you just solved?" She said yes before she'd finished deciding to. She spent 4 hours in a room she would not be able to describe later. Not because she couldn't remember, but because the NDA she eventually signed was specific about architectural details. The room had a table. The table had a laptop, 2 phones, a legal pad, and a pot of coffee that was significantly better than anything she'd had in months. The numbers in front of her were large in the way that large numbers stopped being surprising after a while, and just became notation. She didn't ask what the business was. She was good enough at her job to understand that you didn't always need to know the industry to understand the books. And she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that there were industries she was probably better off not knowing about in detail. What she knew was that the accounting was messy in specific ways. The kind of mess that came from multiple people doing patchwork on a structure that had grown faster than its documentation, and that someone with her particular skill set could straighten it out. She was halfway through the receivables when she realized she hadn't thought about Declan in 3 hours. That was, she thought, something. Rafferty came back at 6. He stood in the doorway and looked at what she'd done. "You found 4 errors," he said. "5, she said. "The 4th one's subtle. You're booking certain transfers as expenses when they should be capitalized. It's changing your depreciation schedule in a way that'll look odd if anyone examines it closely." She paused. "I assume you'd prefer it not look odd." "I would," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a quality to the silence that she recognized. It was the silence after you presented your findings, before the client decided what to do with them. He said, "I have a problem." "You have 5, she said, "but probably more than that." Something crossed his face that on a different kind of man in a different kind of context, she would have called the beginning of a smile. "My bookkeeper," he said, retired, abruptly, 3 weeks ago. She looked at him. "I'm not in a position to bring in a firm," he continued. "I need someone who can work with incomplete documentations, maintain discretion, and is not currently," he paused, "employed elsewhere. And not currently," she said carefully, "getting married, that too." She looked at the spreadsheet, at the 5 errors she'd found in 4 hours, at the coffee cup that had been refilled exactly once, without her asking, and the fact that no one had come in to interrupt her, and the legal pad she'd filled with her small, neat handwriting that was currently more organized than anything she'd produced in the last 3 weeks at the job she'd lost. She thought, this is an objectively insane situation. She thought, Declan is currently at a hotel, maybe with Romy, maybe alone, probably figuring out that she's not coming back. She thought, $11,416, and she had at this moment $2,300 in savings, because she'd put the rest into the wedding fund that was also non-refundable. "What does it pay?" she said. He told her. She stared at the number. "Per month," she said. "Per month," he said. She looked at the spreadsheet. She looked at him. She looked at the coffee. "I'd need to see the full documentation," she said. "What exists of it? Of course. And I have conditions. I expected that. I don't ask questions I don't need to ask," she said. "But when I do ask a question, I need a straight answer. Numbers don't lie, but people who explain numbers sometimes do, and I can tell the difference." He was quiet for a moment. "All right. And I keep my own records," she said, "not to use against you. Because I'm meticulous, and I don't work clean any other way. Fine. And I'm not," she stopped, recalibrated, "I'm not whatever you might be thinking. This is bookkeeping. That's the entire scope." He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Vaux," he said. She'd given him her name at some point. She didn't remember when. "I have people who handle every other category of problem. What I don't have is someone who can find a subtle capitalization error in a receivables ledger in 4 hours." He paused. "This is bookkeeping. That's the entire scope." She looked at the legal pad. She looked at the number he'd offered. She thought about the dress still hanging on the hotel bathroom door, which someone would find eventually and deal with, and which was not her problem anymore. "I'll need an advance," she said, "for the first week, while I close out my prior commitments." Done. She picked up her pen. She did not, it turned out, go home that night. Not because anything improper occurred. Rafferty had been precise, and she appreciated precision. But because when she finally looked at her phone, at the 47 missed messages and the 2 voicemails from her mother that she did not listen to, she realized she had no home that wasn't also full of Declan. His coffee maker, his weekend things, his presents, installed in 7 years of drawers and shelves, which she was not prepared to face at 11:30 at night, with 3 bourbons and a new employment situation in her recent past. There was a room, clean, spare, better appointed than anything she'd lived in. She was told it was temporary. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that temporary was exactly the right word, and she was fine with it. She sat on the edge of the bed and did the math one more time. The wedding, cancelled. The relationship terminated. The career, also terminated, though in this case replaced. The savings, about to become functional again. The sister, a problem she would address when she had the emotional bandwidth for it, which was not currently. She thought about Rafferty, about the way he'd said she stays. Not a request, not a suggestion, but a declarative sentence, the kind that closed a subject. She thought about the scar, and the grey eyes, and the 2 men who moved like furniture when he indicated they should. She thought about the fact that she had, in the space of a single catastrophic morning, walked away from everything she thought her life was, and ended up somewhere that was. She checked the numbers, objectively better than where she'd started. Different. Unknown in ways that were both alarming, and underneath that, something she didn't quite have a word for. Not safe. She wasn't naive. She'd seen enough of the ledger in 4 hours to know that safe was not the correct column, but visible. That was the word, maybe. She'd sat in that room for 4 hours, and no one had come in to check whether she was doing it right. No one had looked over her shoulder or explained something she already knew or rephrased her findings in their own words when she presented them. Rafferty had read the legal pad and said, "You found 4 errors." And when she'd said 5, he'd said all right, like that was simply the accurate number, and there was no reason to negotiate it. She was not used to being the accurate number. She was used to being the one who produced it. The difference, she found, was significant. 3 weeks later, she found the actual problem. It wasn't in receivables. It wasn't in depreciation. It was buried in a subsidiary structure that had been created, she eventually determined, by someone who had understood exactly what they were doing and had been very careful to make it look like they hadn't. She worked through the night. This was not unusual for her. She had a coffee maker by then. She'd asked for one on day 4, and it had appeared within the hour, which she took as a reasonable indicator of how seriously she was being taken, and she had the full documentation, all of it, even the parts that the previous bookkeeper had kept, in a separate system that she'd had to reconstruct from transaction records. She found it at 3:17 in the morning. Someone had been skimming, small amounts, adjusted, hidden in the transfer records, where they'd look like rounding errors if you weren't specifically looking. 412 separate transactions over 19 months. The total was not small. She printed it out. She was the kind of person who printed things out when they mattered. At 3:42, she wrote a summary memo, 1 page because the number spoke for itself, and placed it on top. At 7:15, Rafferty came in. She handed him the memo. She watched him read it. His face didn't change in any dramatic way. He read through it once, then again, then he set it down. "You're certain?" he said. "I've traced every transaction twice," she said. "The documentation is here. If you want, I can walk you through the methodology." "No," he said. "I don't need the methodology. I need to know if you're certain." "I'm certain." He was quiet for a moment that had a particular weight to it. The weight of a man who had just received information that was going to require him to do something he didn't want to do. She said, carefully, "Do you know who it was?" He looked at her. The grey eyes had a quality she'd learned to read over 3 weeks. Not expressive, exactly, but legible if you paid attention. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She had suspected he would. People in his position usually had more information than their books showed. The books were just the part she was qualified to document. "I don't need to know what you do about it," she said. "Good," he said. Then, "Thank you." She'd been thanked for her work before. Clients thanked her, always, in the formal way of someone completing a transaction. "Thank you for the report, Miss Vaux. We'll be in touch." This was different. It was quieter. It was the thank you of someone who had actually been looking for the thing she'd found, not just asking her to look. She picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window at the city doing its morning thing. Cabs, pedestrians, a delivery truck, blocking the intersection it always blocked at this hour, which she'd started to time out of habit. "The Meridian step-up," she said. "I finished the documentation last week. You should be able to file by the end of the month if your attorney has what he needs." "He does," said Rafferty. "He told me." She nodded. She thought about Declan's text messages on the screen of his phone, the column of 13 weeks laid out in front of her like a ledger of small deceptions, each one alone so minor you might overlook it, and all of them together adding up to something she couldn't fix. She thought about Romy's face at Christmas, the wine refill, the eyes that looked just like hers. She thought, "I would have stayed in that apartment for another 7 years. I would have kept covering the gap and calling it fine, and never looked at the full column." She didn't know yet what this was. She was honest enough with herself to admit that. She knew what the numbers were: income, expenses, time, function, and she knew what they weren't. She was not the kind of person who confused a column of figures for a story, or a story for a different kind of balance sheet. But she knew, sitting in that room with her coffee in the morning city, and the printed documentation of something she'd found that no one else had been able to find, that she was, for the first time in longer than she could calculate, not covering a gap. She was the number that made things add up. Rafferty said, 2 days after that, "Your rate is going up." She looked at the figure he wrote on the legal pad between them. She looked at him. "That's not bookkeeping money," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." She looked at the figure again. "What is it money for?" He looked at her with the grey sky eyes that she'd been reading for 3 weeks, and was still, she was honest about this, learning. "It's what someone is worth," he said, "when they're exactly where they need to be." She thought about the hotel bathroom and the dress on the door, the $11,416. The dress had, she'd learned, been picked up by the hotel and was being held at a consignment shop that her mother had arranged, in the particular efficient grief of mothers who did not cry in front of their daughters. She thought, "Declan would have reduced me to a line item. He'd been doing it for 7 years and I'd let him because the rest of the numbers looked right." She picked up her pen. She wrote a counter figure. Not larger, she wasn't performing anything, just adjusted, correctly, for the actual scope of what she'd been doing. Rafferty looked at it. The corner of his mouth moved. "Done," he said. She accepted it the way she accepted all accurate numbers, without ceremony, because the math had already been done and there was nothing left to negotiate. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, indifferent and ongoing, full of people running their own calculations. She had a coffee she hadn't finished, and a ledger she'd closed, and a new page open in front of her, and for the first time in 7 years, every number in the column was one she'd put there herself.